We begin this morning with two quotes regarding the topic at hand. First, epistemology without connection to science becomes an empty scheme. Science without epistemology is, insofar as it is thinkable at all, both primitive and muddled. That's Albert Einstein. And it is the faithfulness of God that allows epistemology to model ontology. That was John Polkinghorne. I'm the Great Baldini, and these are Unintended Consequences. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you're joining us from. We're glad you're here for our fourth installment of Unintended Consequences, where the music is original, the content is organic, and the possibilities are endless. Stay with us for more Unintended Consequences. So glad you guys are here with us today, and I love the pre-chat here. So welcome. This is our fourth installment now of Unintended Consequences, and today's a little bit different. I'm sure that some of you may have worked it out, maybe some didn't. The the title here was if you didn't figure it out, in the chat, did anybody figure out what Only Go to Jan Toylog was all about? I'll give you a second to work it out. It's a double anagram for ontology, and so those of you who know what ontology is, then you're already in there. But ontology really is the branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of being and the theory of being, that looks into who we are and how we get there. And ontology versus epistemology is kind of some of the more complex terms that people might come across when they start studying philosophy. So ontology really is derived from the Greek words ontos, meaning being, and logos, which I'm sure you've heard before, which means to study, the study of. And it tries to pinpoint things around us that actually exist, that are physical, material things. It's the study of nature of being or becoming existent and their differences and similarities. It tries to answer questions that begin with what. So what is and what are these things? The scope of ontology can be generalized from philosophy to other fields like medicine, information, science, or even advanced physics. And it helps us understand questions like what and who is God, and what is a disease, and what happens after death, and what's artificial intelligence. Well, we know that that's artificial, right? So the field really is dedicated toward understanding what things exist or do not exist. As compared with epistemology, which is one of the core branches of philosophy that deals with the aspects of procuring knowledge and how we get there from here. It's more concerned with the natural sources and scope and limits of knowledge. And epistemology, again, also derived from Greek episteme, meaning knowledge, and logos, again, meaning to study. So you're saying the volume is very low, huh? Interesting. Because it seems from where I sit that it's actually pretty good, but tell me if that's better. And again, welcome to everybody. So one of the things that, again, we want to focus on here in this podcast, and as it differs from many of the other podcasts that we all kind of listen to and people that we follow their study, is that, again, I research as well as most others, and you've heard me on some of the other shows, Secrets of Saturn, Crow 777, as far as I can tell, Rogue Ways, and some others, in terms of looking at some of these specific areas and breaking them down. But in the fact that everybody is already kind of doing that, I wanted this to be a bit different, and to really kind of look at this project that I'm working on, the Awakening Project. And as you probably know already, then this really is looking at subjugating or subjectively trying to understand better who wakes up and who doesn't, and what those things are, the indicators, and what correlation there are between people who wake up and people who don't. One of the key things that I've been using in this study, and again, if you haven't, if you're not familiar with it, again, the idea, I'll give you the basic premise. The idea that I had in conversations with Wayne McCroy, Jason Lindgren, Crow, and some others, was that this is a question that's come up quite a bit, is what makes the difference between people who wake up and, as we would use that term, who become aware that much of what we're told, much of the standard narrative, the mainstream narrative, is in fact not only misleading, but some of it's just outright fraud. Our history, the Scaligian timeline, many of the things that we're told in terms of science, that is our cosmology, the history of the world, is provably false. And in fact, what they tell us is so far away from what appears to have been the truth that it serves in terms of, and we discussed this last week on Secrets of Saturn, that it goes right along with this Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars document, in that one of the key aspects in terms of controlling a population is to confuse them, to confuse people and keep them from knowing the truth. And if you can keep them as far away from the truth as possible, and in fact steal their history and make them not understand where they are and who they are, then you have a better chance of controlling them. And it seems, from my observation and that of many others, that once they can convince us and make us believe things that are preposterous, they can tell us anything, and we'll believe it. That there's a car floating around in space, right? That there's an asteroid approaching that has a mask on, right at the same time that people are being forced to wear masks that, by the way, don't do anything, don't do anything but show that you're compliant. And these things are silly and preposterous, but it does seem that a vast majority of the population believes these things, and they are under the spell. And so as we look at it, if you consider it in terms of being spellbound or under a state of hypnosis, this is actually very close to what we see overall, is that people have succumbed to the power of suggestion on a mass scale. And I think this, again, demonstrably so. So the idea of the Awakening Project is to identify those who have broken free from the spell and those who have not, and again, what the correlating factors are. And if you want to join this project, where I announced it first on Secrets of Saturn, January 1st of this year, and began taking submissions. And so it's a very basic thing. To begin with, the phase one, I had a premise in terms of what was probably some of the identifying factors. And so what I asked for was these things: your date of birth and location, so we could include astrological information, a Meyers-Briggs Type Index, or MBTI, and that includes a 4-letter basic breakdown of your Jungian type and how you process information, and then finally just a paragraph or two in your own words about your own awakening project, or your own awakening process, that is, and what brought you to awareness, what it was, what key things were happening, and also how it's affected your life, both in terms of the way you see things and sociologically, relationally, that sort of thing. So we can compare these things and ultimately see if that we can find a way to wake other people up, a deep programming script, if you will. So one of the questions that has come up is why Myers-Briggs? And there has been a variety of people try to, if you haven't heard of it, again, Myers-Briggs were a mother-daughter team who came up with a way to identify. Hello from Switzerland, how are you? Welcome, Lost Orphan, and welcome, everyone. So again, we're talking a little bit about ontology and looking at the Myers-Briggs Type Index today. And so one of the ways this does this is it breaks down into 4 categories, the way that we take in information and process information. And it is, as I've said before, has some inherent limitations. But it is a very powerful tool in helping to understand the way that people think and process information. And this has been used in the corporate world for quite a period of time. It largely, I think, sort of misused in that it's been used not only in corporate situations, but in education, vocational situations and applications, like guidance counselors, to understand, what kind of type you are, and then try to give you here's what you should do for a job or for your career path. It might be helpful to that extent, but it's largely, to me, being misused in that way, as I think many things are misused and misdescribed. Well, during this process, one of the people who has a big background in this is our own. I claim ownership. Our own, right? She's a major part of our community, Rose 777, and you probably know her from Crow 777 Radio. She is his right hand wool man. She's got an amazing memory. She's just a beautiful person. She's got just such a divine spark, and she's a delight and a pleasure to talk to in everything. But she's got quite a big background in the Myers-Briggs process. And so I spoke with her this week about it, and I'd like to share that with you now. So hang on, and we'll introduce Rose. All right, I am the Great Baldini, and we're here with Rose 777. Good morning, Rose.
Good morning, the Great Baldini.
So we're going to talk this morning a little bit more in depth about Jungian types, specifically the Meyers-Briggs Type Index, MBTI, or the Myers-Briggs personality types. And the reason we're talking about this is because this is one of the factors that I'm using in the Awakening Project to determine who's awakening and who's not. And Rose has a wide history with Myers-Briggs. So Rose, tell us a little bit about your background with Myers-Briggs and why you know so much about it.
So, first of all, thank you for including Myers-Briggs in this, because when you first brought it up, I wasn't necessarily near the microphone, and I wanted to say, yes, thank you, because I really think it's a fabulous idea. It all started in 1997, and I was 13 years old, and I was with my cousin in Pennsylvania, and we decided to take the test. I don't even remember how we came upon it, but I just thought that it was brilliant the way they combined these 4 elements together to create all these categories that I thought made a lot of sense when assessing how to best understand where someone's coming from so that you can communicate with them effectively and efficiently, get the point across, not hurt anyone's feelings. It made a ton of sense to me. And so I kept looking into it more and more. And it started off as kind of a fun thing where I would tell all my friends and family to take the test, and then I would make observations about what I may have predicted it would be. And then I would feel like I learned a little bit something about my assumptions about that person. Maybe someone that I thought was extroverted was actually more introverted. When you take the test and you see the questions they're asking, they're so obvious and straightforward. If someone is coming from a place of thinking or feeling or judging or perceiving, sensing, or their intuition, it makes a lot of sense to me that people would approach things in a different way and interpret incoming data in a different way.
So you mentioned four types, or 4 categories. So what are those 4 categories specifically?
The first one would be the sliding scale between extroversion and introversion.
Okay, and what does that mean? Extrovert versus introvert?
Well, if you know me, I'm pretty much an extrovert in every sense of the
word. No way.
I feel really comfortable in the spotlight. I feel comfortable in large groups of people, and I'm kind of in your face. And I'm kind of a classic, I guess. When I've traveled abroad, I'm very American. There's something in Dutch. There's a Dutch word called nuchterheid, and it kind of means calm and sober, but not necessarily like you're drunk, but the Dutch are very chill. And so
Stoic.
Whenever I've been there, they've said, yes, exactly. They've been like, je heeft geen nuchterheid. You don't have any of it.
Right.
That's what they would say. You don't have that.
You got no chill,
if you want to
baby.
be more Dutch, you got to chill out.
You got zero chill. Right. So those who are introverted, for example, the opposite. Now, they're not necessarily shy, right?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, I'm actually close to the introverted scale in Myers-Briggs.
So,
Is that
okay, so
interesting?
it is. And so explain why that is. Explain again those differences. So extroverts deal better with groups of people. Introverts like the alone time, and they think inside themselves. But what makes the determining factor between whether someone's an introvert or extrovert? And how does that sliding scale work?
That is such a good question, Baldini. I think that what determines where they land on the sliding scale is preferences. So when I'm when I'm out in public, I could feel comfortable, but I'm basically just dealing with my reality. In truth, I truly enjoy alone time. Once I'm with a lot of people for a while, it's kind of like then when I'm off the stage, I just need to, isolate a little bit, and that's what I truly enjoy. The reflection period. I like to have experiences and then reflect on it. But I can only speak for myself with that.
Well, I can agree with that, and I think many people do misunderstand to some degree these terms. We use them sort of interchangeably. Extrovert. We often think of people who are hams, right, or they love the spotlight, that sort of thing. People who
Hmm.
are performers, and then introverts is people who might be shy, wallflowers, right, withdrawn. That's not necessarily how we're using these words in the context of the Myers-Briggs assessment, right?
Right, right. It's how you express yourself, I think, in terms of communicating and how you relate in interpersonal relationships is what I think the main focus is. And in the test, you're talking about not actually how you think you should be, but how you are, and then not necessarily how you think you should feel, but how
You respond.
um, you respond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and so one of the things, and we'll talk about this more, is that I actually migrated over time, and many people do. Their test results migrate over time, and I went from, well, the whole thing was ENFP to INTJ, which, yeah, I
Wow.
know, right? Which is a pretty heavy thing, but part of that is because I sit right in the borderline between I and E on the very first score between introvert and extrovert, and that's always kind of been the case. And what kind of I learned to understand is it has less to do with even sometimes how you express yourself, but as you said, preferences, and also how you tend to recharge, right? So there are people who they get charged up by being around groups of people. They're fine being
Right.
alone, but they get charged up by that. Other people who it wears on them to be around people, and they need the alone
Mm.
time to sort of to recharge. There are people who are very far on the end of the spectrum in both of these. For example, my wife has severe social anxiety as a she's been diagnosed with severe social anxiety. And this means that she gets very awkward in social circumstances. It's not that she's unable to express herself, it's that she doesn't understand or pick up on cues. And this has to do because she's on the autism spectrum, and she's got an immensely high IQ, pushing 180. So she's definitely not dumb. But her ability to recognize and immediately process social cues is different. So being aneurotypical, right? It causes her stress, and so she just doesn't want to deal with people. And as a result, she tries to avoid social interactions. Now, it's not that she doesn't
Hmm.
like people, right? It's that it causes her stress, and so she recharges much better in very, interpersonal relationships, just one to one or by herself. Right. So anyway, so
Right.
that's the first one, the introvert versus extrovert. All right. So the next category.
The next category would be sensing versus intuition. And this is the one where I flipped. Before I continue, though, I'm just really quick curious. How old were you when you flipped? Were you over 30 or under 30?
Over 30.
All right,
So
that's what I
I
thought.
was ENFP from my mid 20s when I first took the test, all the way up until probably almost 41. And the numbers kept getting closer and closer to those center lines. And then by the time that I was in my mid 40s, I flipped. And some of them pretty hard. And part of that had to do with changes in my life, and part of it had to do with decisions I made, and part of it had to do, I think, from my perspective, as a result of the awakening process. I cared less about some things and had stronger preferences toward other things, and as a result, I'm now much stronger in the NT than FP.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. So, what changed for me was that started off going back and forth as a teenager from ENTJ to ESTJ. And then after the age of 20, I never tested as an ESTJ again. It's always been consistently an ENTJ. So with sensing, we're kind of talking about our senses, what we see, touch, taste, we're taking information in and responding to it. And then intuition, you're more kind of going with what your gut feeling is. The two middle categories, I think, are heavily related to each other. So I like to discuss it along with the.
They are. In fact, this is one of the key indicators in this awakening project, is that
Okay.
most of our respondents are NT.
I knew it.
Yeah,
I knew.
and
I
because
can ask you.
yeah, those things go together. And
Uh-huh.
what happens, especially with the intuition, the in versus sensing, one of the key indicators, as I understand it, is that sensing, people look external for external clues to help interpret things, whereas the intuition, they look for internal clues and a consistency within themselves. So this is a big factor in this awakening process, is that those who are S are much more likely to look outside themselves for confirmation whether or not the story is true, whereas those who are an N will be, they have to look inside themselves to see whether that rings true with them or not. Right, and so you can see how this would play out in a social setting. Is that those who are going to be an S category would look for an external approval or someone nodding and saying yes, this is true, and they go, oh, okay, right, and so they agree with that. And then the the next category. T versus F, which is thinking versus feeling, and again, you can see how those would play together. So, describe a little bit of the third category, rather, thinking versus feeling.
Right. So the way that you respond to stimulus is from, either a logical standpoint where you're thinking, or you're coming with how you feel, which would be an emotional reaction. And by the way, since we kind of just both nerded out over NT, anyone out there who is not an NT, anyone who associates with being a sensor or a feeler or a sensing thinker or an intuitive feeler, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your ability
or that
to
you
be
can't
awake
wake
at
up.
all.
Yeah, no, that's not. It's not like that. It's that simply people who are going to have a predisposition or be more likely to come to it on their own. So it doesn't mean that that people who are FP or feeling that they're a lost cause. That's not necessarily the case, right? Because
And you know what? Think about this. Let's not think about just the personality types that are predisposed to being more aware, but then think about how your personality type might affect your response to being aware.
Exactly.
I have a lot of feelers out there, my friend, and I'm thinking about you all right now. Let's put it that way. I know that you're being driven crazy right now due to the current situation, and this can make one very emotional. Even an intuitive thinker like me, I'm feeling very emotional these days. So this is impacting people a lot right now.
Well, and this is one reason why I didn't want to give away some of the results too early. I didn't want to unnecessarily or influence anybody's responses, because I will say that despite the fact that we have a large predominance. Now, I said this is one of the things that I show proof of concept with this project, and what the premise was is that that certain people are more predisposed to the awakening process than others, and that is proven in the fact that the NT, the intuitive thinker, just between those two, they represent just around 5 or 6% of the total population. INTJ, for example, like I am, represents less than 3%. And so the intuitive thinkers is a very small category, and yet they represent more than 95% of our respondents. But that having been so, obviously that's statistically significant. However, we have respondents in every category. So again, it doesn't mean that if you are not an an intuitive thinker that you're that there's anything wrong with you or that you're somehow less than, because we have respondents in every single category. Now,
Right.
again, those numbers are less, and so it also depends on circumstances to some degree. However, again, so I will say that again, there's just certain people who are more predisposed to it because of the way that they think and they process information. That's all. But it did show proof of concept. So, all right. So we have, and then one of the things we mentioned, and I think it's worth repeating, is that the two middle categories tend to go together, right? So whether you're an intuitive thinker, an intuitive feeler, a thinking judger, right? So
A sensing thinker.
right, exactly. So these often produce what they call a secondary category, right? Which often shows up at the end. Sometimes they'll add a fifth letter to indicate how those things work together, because it does produce a slightly different output, I guess is the way to put it, from the input stimulus. When you put these categories together, it sort of tends to modulate or bend a little bit different way in the way people process data. So maybe talk a little bit about that, how those two middle categories kind of work together.
All right. Well, the first thing that comes to mind that I want to clarify is that if you identify with being a thinker, that doesn't mean that if you identify with being a feeler, it doesn't mean that you're not logical. And when we think about the N and the T together, I think that that's a nice balance when it comes to this awakening process, because it's balanced in a sense that you're thinking logically, but you're using your intuition at the same time. And that's kind of a really beautiful marriage between the masculine and feminine when in regards to discernment.
Absolutely, and
Does that make sense?
absolutely. And I would also throw out again that the idea of feeling and intuition, those are really good things, right? So simply being cold and logical, or the Mr. Spock type, that's not necessarily what these categories indicate. But if that's the idea that you're getting from our conversation, that would be inaccurate, right? It's simply
Right.
these are descriptions of a way of processing information, and that people have a tendency to do kind of one or the other, and that's why that they've grouped these. Now, understand, I think overall, and I've mentioned this numerous times, that this is not sort of the end all be all. These are not hard categories, and keep in mind also that psychology in itself is not a hard material science, right? It is not very objective. It's very difficult to measure, and
Right.
so we're making a lot of some assumptions here. But as Rose said at the beginning, this is a very powerful, very useful tool to help better understand, and that's why
Right.
we're using it, and why I'm using it in this process is it does help better understand, and there are ways that people do respond, and I think that's proven. But again, these are not hard, concrete things. They're very squishy,
Yeah.
right?
And it provides us with some language in order to share these kinds of ideas.
Exactly, and to better express what we're talking about. One of the things I've noticed, and I mentioned this, and this is an episode that I've been meaning to do with Jason and Wayne on Secrets of Saturn. We touched on it a few times about how powerful language is, right? And one of the ideas of linguistic determinism, that the language that you use determines the thoughts, right? And so there's also some premises that go back and forth, some ideas about whether it's one way or the other, whether the thought precedes the language or the language precedes the thought. But the idea that the language that you choose determines the way you look at things. For example, English is, well, let me start here. German, for example, is very good at being precise. They don't rely on adjectives the way English does. So if we were to say something is a red house, right, that in German that would become a single word and very specific. And they often make very long compound words by providing two or three adjectives in there. The small red house, right? And these
Right.
become very specific. So it's a great language, for example, for engineering, which I think makes sense given their culture. French, on the other hand, is a very, and again, I use the word kind of squishy, fuzzy language with a lot of implication and implicature, where things are not very concrete. There's a lot of room for leeway there. And French has often been used as a language for diplomacy throughout history, because it gives you a lot of leeway to imply things without painting yourself into a corner. In fact, French and German both have been used as legal official legal languages for these very reasons. That French gives you the ability to put things in such a way that leaves one party with a lot of latitude, whereas German allows very precise description of what the situation is, so that there's not a lot of latitude, and that's why both were used. English is a language which well describes visual things, and so we're able to use a lot of florid words to describe things that we can see. What it's really bad at is describing things inside, or thought processes, or feelings. For example, we have the word love, which gets used over and over. I love pizza. I love that show. I love you. Whereas, for example, even in Greek, there are at least 5 words for love and about 16 words that imply it. In Latin, which is one of the reasons I think they killed it, it is an inflected language. What happens is the intention is carried in the verb, and so the meaning, what you intend to do, comes out in the verb. And in fact, the verb and noun structure is irrelevant in Latin, such that in English, for example, you can say the lion saw the dog. If you reverse that and say the dog saw the lion, it has a very different meaning. In Latin, you could never confuse those two. That you would always know that it was the lion who doing the action, his intention, and what happened thereafter, regardless of which order you put the words in, which makes some very interesting poetry combinations, and why Latin was the primary choice of academia for so long. And again, the idea that it simply died a natural death is poppycock, as Crow would say. It was intentionally killed because there were, from my view, there were so many phrases which carried high-minded principles and ideas that if it was used commonly, people would grow up with these high-minded principles and ideas as part of the language, and that simply wasn't allowed. So as we come back then, let's bring it back full circle. Using language to describe some of these processes inside, English is a poor language to describe some of these matters of the heart and feeling. And so we sometimes struggle to put these things and to quantify them. We have often said that mathematics is a good language sometimes for describing some scientific processes, but it also allows you to lie, right? Because you can misrepresent things very badly using mathematical processes.
Right, because you can define certain variables in different way.
Exactly.
And other people may not know the definitions that you're using, and we see this all the time in the legal system as well.
Exactly. And this is why, again, English has now become the primary language for legal documents worldwide, because there is this misdirection and in fact, spell casting. And I find it very interesting that the same word spell is used to put together the letters that comprise a word and the words that comprise a magical action. So again, that's a very interesting thing there. But the fact that we're using English, and that it's a living language that changes constantly. However, it's been truncated by many orders of magnitude. Just in the last 100 years, the number of words in use has gone from over 100,000 regularly used words to now less than 10,000, which is a frightening thought, that people are less able to express thoughts and ideas. And in fact, this premise was laid forth very clearly in the book 1984, as we mention a lot, from George Orwell, that it was a party function to continually reduce the number of words that were available to be used. One of the characters was very delighted that they were so successful that he said, in a year, we wouldn't even be able to have this conversation because the words wouldn't exist for us to do it. And he was thrilled about that. So, yes, but we see this especially in, for example, use of technology with Twitter speak. right?
Right.
And shortening things like just using the letters U, R, and that sort of thing have become now very acceptable, even in corporate communication, which I find
Yeah.
mind blowing, right?
And I also find that disempowering. And what it reminds me of is the idea of Jesus coming with a sword, and the word is within the word sword. It's a de-weaponization of human beings because our words can be used to defend ourselves.
Yes, and sword. All you have to do is take the S and move it to the end. It becomes words.
Exactly. But yeah, that's what I was trying to point
Yeah,
out.
it's not even an anagram. It's like it's a direct one to one. You just move one letter to the
Uh-huh.
end, and it changes the entire meaning. And in fact, this is that same idea is held also within Scripture when you talk about the putting on the full armor of God. The sword is the Scripture. That's exactly what the one to one direct metaphor that they
Yeah.
use is the power of words is your weapon. And we
Yeah.
also it's been carried in the idea that the pen is mightier than the sword. And again, that's one of those ideas that was originally put in Latin to begin with and has been translated. And often things are lost in translation. You can't carry
That's right.
these ideas very well. All right. So now that we've established that language is it's a sometimes difficult thing to use to describe what we're doing, but Myers-Briggs, at least these personality types, gives us a kind of language to discuss the processes that go on inside. And keep in mind that with these 4 categories with 2 letters, that gives us 16 combinations. Now we haven't gone to the last one yet, so let's look at the last category.
Okay, the last category would be judging versus perceiving.
Oh my God, you're
And I
so
think that this
judgmental.
is, I think exactly, it's a huge stigma. I don't want to be associated with either one of those. I always want to be completely balanced in both, or else I feel kind of retarded. So I'm offended by every, test result
But
if
again,
it's
that's
not close to the middle.
right. But again, that's not what we mean when we talk about judging, right?
It should be
Or
evaluating. How about
perceiving.
evaluating? Could we change it?
Right. I think that's probably evaluation or critical evaluation, right? What might be a better way to put it. But the words that they've chosen
Well,
are
there are two sides of the evaluation spectrum. Perceiving and judging are the two aspects of how you're making an evaluation. It's like you're extroverted, like in my case, extroverted, intuitive thinking, and then you're taking those 3 are preceding my judgment,
right.
and which is how I'm evaluating. It's how I'm responding, the manner in which I'm evaluating. Does that make
It
sense?
does, and that's what we're trying to explain. I think that the purpose, in fact, of this conversation is to try to better explain how these things work together and why it's important with this study, and in fact to better understand even yourself or others. One of the things I can interject here is that one of the most common things that people do, in fact, it's almost universal, is that we try to understand other people's actions, behaviors, thoughts. We try to understand them through our own perception. And so if we look at and see that they did something, we go, well, why would they do that? And we try to look for the motivation behind why they do that. And almost everyone evaluates it by running it through the filter of the only reason I would do that is so and so,
And it doesn't work.
and you're
Would you
guaranteed.
agree with that?
Yes, you're guaranteed to be 100% wrong.
Failure.
Fail.
And also it's also kind of a fallacy when people say, well, why would they lie to me? I would never lie.
Right.
know?
Yes, and that's usually the first question that comes up when this idea of looking at the nature of the world and the fact that we have been deceived and it's illusion is the first question. Well, why would they lie? And I keep saying that's a horrible question, right? If I come into a room and I see a person lying there in a pool of blood with a knife next to them, I'm not going to say, "Oh my God, why would someone do this?" I mean, you might ask that question, but I don't need to know why to know what's happened. Right, I can clearly see that that there has been a murder here, right? And so that's all I need to know to understand. Now, we always do want to know why, and motive is often used in a court of law in murder trials, right? So you have means, motive, and opportunity, but motive is one of the primary things that they try to prove. But motive is not necessarily relevant in this case to understand that it's happening. It may be helpful to understand the pattern. And for example, it is helpful for me to understand some of the behaviors of the cadre and the powers that ought not be, because I better understand their motives. And so it's easier for me to see their behaviors and to anticipate what they're going to do. But it's not necessary or even relevant to understand or perceive that they are doing certain things. You just need enough information to show that what they're saying is not true. And this is why I often say that the name of us being truthers, or the truth movement, is rather a misnomer in that we don't have enough information to know the exact truth, but we do have enough information to falsify the claims, the positive claims being made by the official narrative. They say it's this. Well, what we can do is determine that it is not that. Right?
Calling out the fraud.
Exactly. We don't know exactly what the truth is because they've hidden it, and we weren't there. So it's impossible to know the exact cause and course of action that brought us to this point. But what we do know is that what they're saying is a lie, and that gives us at least a lot of place to start with.
Yeah. There's about NTs. I'm a very proud NT, and there's forums online for NTs, and there's a little bit of arrogance in there that I noticed, and that could definitely get in the way of someone's ability to properly discern and evaluate. But for me, my biggest setback with being an NT, in this context, I like to call it paralysis by analysis. I will go in circles in my mind, and it will prevent me from jumping into action.
Yes, analysis paralysis is absolutely a thing, and I find that I'm susceptible to it as well. Sometimes, doing the wrong thing is better than doing nothing.
Right. And so that's why when it comes to this process of awakening, the process of uncovering the fraud and coming into awareness as like a verb, true thing, we're in the process of making an attempt at avoiding solipsism and trying to uncover the truth. It's a group effort. And I think about how there might be people in our even immediate, social circle that have helped me because of their ability to use their sensing abilities or, their more feeling abilities to help me interpret and comprehend the information coming my way in a more useful application. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and I have said this. You're preaching to the choir a bit here, Rose, because I have said over and over that no one that I have ever found knows has all the answers. Right? They have bits and pieces, and that's why it's incumbent upon the person to go around looking, doing the research themselves, and looking for all the relevant information. And the group effort is super important because these rabbit holes go so far and so deep and so wide that I think no one person could really, in fact, even those doing it that don't know all of what's going on, because they're very highly organized, and they're also siloed, right? So compartmentalized into different groups. They don't even know what they're doing. So the idea that any one person could know everything going on is to me kind of preposterous. And so whether it's certain people looking into certain aspects of it, and then we all come together and compare, or as you say, using the different aspects that each of us have, our individual and unique abilities and ways that we process information, to look at these different aspects differently. I'm reminded of the story of the four kids who, had never, this back in the 1930s, and they'd never seen an elephant before, and the circus came to town, and the boxcar came up, and it said elephant on the outside, and so they were trying to look inside, and it was closed, but there was knotholes in it, right? And each one is looking through a knothole to describe what they saw, and one person saw, like a tree trunk, and another person saw it's a big gray snake, right? And another person said, no, it's a big, leather thing. And so they argued, and got into a fight over what they were seeing. Well, the fact is that none of them were wrong, but each of them could only see a particular aspect of it. And I think that's a pretty fair analogy to many things in the world, that each of us only sees a particular aspect or angle of a greater whole. And if we work together to put those together instead of arguing over, what it is that we see, I think we're going to stand to come out much better and have a better understanding overall.
Absolutely. And that's why I didn't really finish my Meyers-Briggs life story.
Okay. Yeah. Well, now we're going to jump all the way back to the beginning. So fill us in then again.
Well, it was more of like a hobby to begin with. And then there was one point when I was at Santa Barbara City College trying to get my alcohol and drug counseling license.
Oh my God, I
And
did that too. I did anger management and substance abuse counseling in California.
I know, it's so
That's
much fun.
crazy.
But then during the internship, I realized that my personality didn't want to tell people what they needed to hear. I wanted to be friends with everybody and tell them what they wanted to hear,
Ooh, that's
which is
hard for
not
counseling.
conducive.
Yeah.
I want to be people's friend too much. I wanted to hang out with everyone. It just wasn't going to work. But I learned so much, and I changed my what I thought was going to be my majors so many times. I don't even think I could count anymore. So
Then you
anyway,
should have gone into
I finished
statistics.
all the classes, and one of them was a once a week Saturday for 4 weeks. It was just one credit, and it was Myers-Briggs. And so at that point, I was like, "Yeah, I was right. I've been looking into this forever. Back then I would say things like, I'm already a Myers-Briggs expert." And then so going through that, I just, they looked at it from a more corporate standpoint in terms of picking like what your job is. What am I going to do with my life after this? When I was when I was taking the course, I was like, should I be an alcohol and drug counselor? Because this is telling me I'm supposed to be a CEO.
Right. And just for the note, again, it has been, the Myers-Briggs test has been used for decades in the corporate world, both in the hiring process and used in sort of like school counseling, guidance counselor to say, what should you do for a job? Yeah. So it's been a tool for that. All right. So continue.
But no, there's sometimes I go back and forth about this. This is part of my analysis paralysis thing, about whether or not it's a good idea to use it for your career, but more rather how do I best conduct myself and communicate once I've established that career? Because I have a feeling that people's desire to do something, if they feel like they've been called to do something, it could be a career that it's not associated with their Myers-Briggs personality.
No, I agree. I think its best purpose as a tool is just understanding, right? It just helps give you one more knothole, if you will, to look through to better understand people and how they operate.
Right. So when I was a training manager for tech support and customer service for a software company, a remote access software company, I would kind of try to decide how to help people figure out how to either provide technical support or customer service. And those are two different things. One personality type might do better in one area and another might do better with just simple cancellations or customer retention. People might just want to follow steps. Me personally, I am very extroverted and I love social interaction, but I also, the intuitive thinker in me really likes monotonous, repetitive, methodical activity. And even though I'm extroverted, I do like, solo work. So I would have people take the test and use the test as an icebreaker for a really meaningful conversation. And then I'd also, going into the conversation, use the test to know how I was going to act. How much of it was I going to joke around? Was I going to get personal, or was I going to stick to the program and be all business? So applying that over and over again in that job just made me more obsessed with this. But you know what? After a while, as I was starting to wake up, and this is why I was so excited when you brought it up, because it was kind of life affirming, is that I kept thinking, you know what, now that I'm becoming more aware and learning about the human nature and the human condition, maybe it's wrong to put people into 16 categories. So then I went to the other side of the spectrum and was kind of feeling a little bit guilty and think people are infinitely valuable and unique. But obviously this is just another case of paralysis by analysis. And we got to use common sense here, man. You use it for where it's useful, and then we obviously know that people have the divine spark and are unique.
Absolutely.
So
And again, I keep
wasn't
saying
interested.
it's a tool, and it's a useful tool. I mean, a hammer isn't very good for opening a can. I mean, you could, I suppose, but you're not going to get the
Right.
results that you want. So, it's a tool when used properly to help you understand. Now, it is one of a variety of different ways to look at the personality spectrum. I think most psychologists and psychiatrists would agree that there is some consistency between how people input and process data, how they absorb it, and how they treat it. We know from neuroplasticity and neuroscience that there are ways in which we learn. There's the grouping and pattern recognition and how we do that. But this is not the only means or tool that's been used, especially during the 20th century and beyond. For example, the Enneagram, the Big Five. Can you offer a comparison between Myers-Briggs and some of the others?
I'm not that familiar with other tools, but like a comparison I like to make in a more general sense is that people will look at astrology like in a horoscope sense, which is more of a misconception. But really, it's more like how you plant a garden and how you operate is kind of an astrological thing because it has to do with the time of year, So a lot of people will look at Myers-Briggs and think, oh, like this is meaningless. It's just like astrology, but it's really just a practical application of nature and how we observe things. And so I think that a lot of other tests are, I even think that taking a narcissism test is a fun icebreaker to have a conversation, to get to know someone, to help them have a more holistic view, just to better understand where someone's coming from. And what I've done is I've actually taken this narcissism test online. You take it with someone, and it's so revealing when you can just be honest about how you feel with each question, because it's not like a negative thing. When people look at Myers-Briggs, they might compare it to astrology in a negative way, like it's a horoscope, like it's a meaningless assessment that is all about conjecture and just to make the person feel good about who they are, But really, that's kind of like a misapplication of the astrological idea. In reality, we use astrology in a common sense, practical way, like growing a garden. So you're going to grow one plant at a certain time of year, not because of some conjecture. It's because of observation over the whole entire human existence. We know that we're supposed to plant a grape at a different time that we plant a strawberry. And so in that same sense, we're looking at these different elements of human behavior and we're making practical applications. I'm not going to roll up to someone who's heavily introverted and sensitive and give them a massive hug and shake them and say, you have to come to a metal concert with me and mosh.
Yeah, that is an incredibly astute observation that people want to put, for example, tools like astrology and Myers-Briggs into a poo-poo category. It is meaningless and kind of a froofy way of, as you said, making themselves feel better. And oddly enough, there is some correlation between the two, is that they are oblique ways of looking at things and giving us better insight, but it is not, again, a material, concrete thing. So the sky clock itself, when used properly, is a powerful tool and has been used by cultures throughout history, with fantastic results, obviously. So in the same way, using tools like Myers-Briggs or any of the assessment tools to help better understand and sort of at least give some sense of meaning and a language, again, that we can express it with and describe it, is a very powerful, helpful tool. So that's a very astute observation. One of the things that another knock that often Myers-Briggs gets is that the people after whom it's named, Myers and Briggs, were a mother-daughter team, neither of who had academic degrees in psychology or sociology. So can you address that at all and help us understand better how they came to this? Do you know about that?
Well, the higher the education, the more the indoctrination.
I think I've heard that before.
I consider that a good thing. I heard that from you.
I think I've heard that before. Yes, the higher the education, the deeper the indoctrination.
So it probably helps. They're probably using more common sense. When you take the test, the questions are so straightforward. Do you like being in the center of the room, or do you usually go by the wall?
Yeah.
you know?
And many of the, often some of the responses I get from people when they first take it, it's like, well, all these questions, they depend, right? Oh, it's situational. It depends. I'm like, exactly, right? Just use your first instinct and say, what are you most likely to do, and not what you think you should
Think
do,
you should do exactly,
or
exactly.
more
Not what
like,
you think you should do. How are you? How are you? And what is your natural inclination? That's what your personality is. It's not, and it doesn't mean that if you think you should be away and then you decide that you don't act in the way that you should, it doesn't mean that you are, not living your life properly.
living your best
It just
life. Yeah, right.
living your I'm living my best life. I am the Myers-Briggs type that I aim to be. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah,
You
no, it
can't
doesn't.
be a type that you aim to be. You
That's
are
it.
what you are, and you got to accept it and know that you are so valuable and useful in this awareness process. I can't help it. I have a friend, and we both feel the same way about this. And so you have to tell me if you can relate to this idea. We feel like we have a football field in our brains with all these different characters all over the football field that we can zoom in on with our mind's eye at any time. Like a football field full of different personalities who I constantly am in admiration of and try to use in my everyday discernment and how I decide to conduct myself.
Yeah, I mean, I have, certain, I would say, kind of an empath, right? I can pick up very quickly on people's state of mind and emotion. And also with the knowledge of Myers-Briggs and other tools of assessing how they're most likely to process and how they're most comfortable in handling, managing information and social cues, I will adjust myself to best fit what they're going to be comfortable with. And, I've had many people give me a knock like, oh, you're a chameleon. You're just trying to be what they, you're just trying to be what they want you to be. It's like, no, why would I ever intentionally make somebody uncomfortable or approach them in a way that they're less likely to deal with? Why would I not want to, approach them in a way that they're comfortable with? That doesn't make any sense to me. It
Exactly.
does make sense that I'm able to adjust and shift a little bit because all those things are within me. I mean, keep in mind that even these 4 categories of the Myers-Briggs all are based on percentages. And even if you're very high percent, like say 68 to 32% in a category, you still have 32% of that other type, right? So it means that you can tap into and are capable of using those skills. So if you're a thinker, for example, you can still feel, right? It doesn't mean that you're absolutely incapable of it. It means that you're more likely under more circumstances to approach things in a certain way. But I think we all have certain capabilities that we're able to tap into from time to time, and simply better understanding what those are and how to apply them means that you have a bigger tool set, right? So instead of just having a hammer and a screwdriver, now you've got an entire tool set, including woodworking tools and a drill press and all kinds of different things that you can now make fabulous furniture with, and not just knock holes in things, right? So so over time, as you begin to expand your mind and better understand these things, the more tools you have at your capability, right, to use these things. And for example, in the awakening process, in the awakening project rather, that I'm working on, one of the things I'm using is the astrological chart, right? So to understand how that might play in. It is less corollary than the Myers-Briggs at this point, but it is still there, right? And there is that does influence, and from what I can tell, to a degree, it does influence the personality type. Right. So it's not 100% based on the astrological sign, but the astrological sign does seem to play a part in addressing what Myers-Briggs type they are. Right, including there are other factors, of course, including your family of origin and your history over time, and how you respond to things and the certain social skills that you develop, to make your way in the world. But still, these things are all they're all tools. They're all better ways to better help understand the world around us. So, Rose, anything you want to add here as we come to the end of this?
I think this has been a terrific conversation. I am so I'm so pleased. This has been great.
It's
Thanks.
always a delight to talk to you, and you're so full of not only life, and you just have that divine sparkle over you, but always bring these again oblique, sort of obtuse angles of seeing things that I hadn't thought of before, and so this is why I love talking to people and getting different ideas and different viewpoints from people, even and sometimes especially if we don't see things the same way. I love that,
Yeah.
right? I don't want to get caught in any kind of echo chamber, which would be difficult for me because I have yet to meet anybody who sees things exactly the way I do. Right?
Right.
That would be weird. But I love getting different people's ideas and how they see things, rather than so many people want to just seem to argue over it and get people
Yeah.
to see things their way. And from my perspective, I like talking about it. I want to better understand their view, and I sometimes get frustrated if they're unable to even try to see things the way that I see it. That's a frustration for me. But because I want people to, I want people to understand better, right? I want to share the information that I have and help it and see if it helps them see things differently and help them manage their way through the world. But it's always a delight talking to you, and I love you so much, Rose. You're just awesome.
I love you too, TGB. You're the
You
best.
are the best. And so we ended with sort of a mutual admiration society, which is awesome. Thank you, Rose, so much for joining me and giving us your wisdom and insight into the Myers-Briggs Type Index. So again, this is going to bring to pretty much a close this fourth episode of Unintended Consequences. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And again, if you want to share your awakening story, or even a part of it, you can remain anonymous if you choose. Send me an email at unintended.consequences3@gmail.com. I'm still taking submissions for the Awakening Project as well. That includes sending me your date of birth and location. That allows us to do the astrological information and take a current Myers-Briggs type index or a Myers-Briggs personality assessment. You don't need to spend the $50 at the official quote Myers-Briggs site. You can go to any of them. One of them I use is 16 personalities. That's the number 16personalities.com. There's a free one there that you don't have to register or you give them any more information. You just take the test, and any test that's more than 30 questions should be appropriate. So they're going to give you a result in 4 letters, again, like INTJ, ENFP, 4 letters and sometimes 5. And if they provide the percentages, offer those as well. Again, that helps us sort of categorize things. And then finally, submit, a couple of paragraphs. More is better. It doesn't have to be, complete novel, but, the more is helpful to tell me about your own journey, your own awakening. What was it that triggered you? What was your first indication that things are not as described? Maybe a little bit about your family origin and background. And also, and this is a key one, how has it affected your life, both in the way that you see things and sociologically, relationally, that sort of thing. So again, send me that at unintended.consequences3@gmail.com. Some people have chosen to record rather than type it. That's perfect. And so then we'll, once I kind of get these together, probably another 6 to 8 weeks before I finish all the tabulation in factor phase 1, and then we'll move on to phase 2, and we'll include a few other things in there, such as blood type and a few other things as well. And then I'll begin later this year working on the awakening script, or in other words, like a deprogramming script that you can try out on people who might fit some of the qualifications of being potentially awake. So with that, we'll wrap up today's show. Thanks again, everybody, for coming and being with us today. I really do genuinely care about each of you, and thank you again so much. I promised that I would end some of these shows with some of these old songs that Joe and I did, along with our late friend Jim. And sort of as a tribute to him, these are really bad representations. I admit they were recorded in the early 2000s and intended just as rehearsal guide tracks for a band that was reviving some of these songs. But at least they give you kind of the idea of it. And again, it's original music that I can use. This is primarily me. Let's see, I'm doing the vocals and playing the bass, and then Joe and I wrote the songs. So there you go. And this one is called Streams in the Desert. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you guys again next week.
Starlight slip away, trust the light, pray for dawn. In the morning, see the sun. I cross the desert to find the well was dry. I closed my eyes, found a river inside that flows to the end of time. Voices speak, none are heard. Silence has the final word. Stories all sound the same till you hear them call your name. I crossed the desert to find the well was dry. I closed my eyes, found a river inside that flows to the end of time. Fading sun sinks again. Night as always makes amends. But as we sleep, dreams reveal all the knowledge we conceal. And I cross the desert